So we're continuing our discussions of the observable class. We're now going to talk about yet another factory method that's defined in the observable class. And this particular factory method is going to be used in order to generate an observable stream. And as usual, this is a factory method a la the factory methods we've come to know and love from the Gang of Four book. So what does the generate operator do? It returns a synchronous and stateless generator of values. And this generator parameter that's passed in here, this generator thing, is going to be called in a loop by the generate method, and it's going to emit values. You can see here that the emitter, which is what's passed in here, has a bunch of methods like on complete, on error, on next, and so on. And the callback that's being invoked should call these methods to signal either a value that's been generated or some kind of terminal event, either an error or an on complete event, indicating things worked successfully. What comes back from generate is an observable, and this observable is known as a cold observable, which is a funny name. There's different kinds of observables in RxJava. There's hot observables and there's cold observables. Hot observables, you can think of it like a radio station, which broadcasts stuff, and whenever you connect to the radio station, whenever you turn to the frequency on the dial, you'll just start hearing whatever's playing at the moment. It doesn't go back and replay from the beginning. Obviously, streaming services do that, but a radio station, a traditional radio station, doesn't. Cold observables, in contrast, can be used to generate the set of items uniquely for each observer that is subscribed to the observable. So you'll start over from the beginning, whatever the beginning is, and it'll start emitting from that. So if you have 3 observers or 3 subscribers that are observing on an observable, whenever they subscribe, then they're going to get the information generated from the generator from the, quote, beginning. Of course, sometimes the beginning is hard to say because it's generated randomly. If you have random number generators, they won't always be the same values, but you start over from the beginning. The generate operator has an interesting characteristic in that it can only generate one event at a time. And that allows it to provide a very simple form of back pressure because it's just doing one thing at a time as opposed to multiple things. So here's a very simple example that will demonstrate the use of an emitter. And you can see here what the emitter does is it calls the onNext method, generating a random big fraction that's not reduced. And every time generate calls back to that lambda expression, it'll call that particular operation and get a new unreduced big fraction. In contrast, some of the other creational operators, factory methods that we've looked at before, like create, can be used to produce events whenever they want to. They aren't limited by flow control. And that has a blessing and a curse. One of the nice things about that is you can blast data out very quickly. The downside is you can blast data out too quickly. And if you've ever watched this classic I Love Lucy episode from probably the 50s or maybe early 60s, Lucy and her pal are in I think it's a bakery or something like that, and they're supposed to take pies or cakes or whatever these things are off the conveyor belt and put them in a box, but the conveyor belt's coming too fast. And so they end up like stuffing the food in their mouths, and it was like a classic comedy bit showing what happens if you don't have back pressure. Project Reactor, no surprise, has a generate operator that works in pretty much the same way as the one from RxJava. There are some differences. They use some different types. They don't use an emitter. They use this thing called a synchronous sync, which is a funny name. And you can see it works somewhat the same idea. You emit something, they have a next method as opposed to on next, but it's more or less the same kind of thing. And just to be rounding out the comparisons with other existing streaming-oriented frameworks that we've looked at, the Java Streams framework also has a generate method that works in pretty much the same way as the generate method works that comes with RxJava, in that you give it some kind of lambda expression, and it will call that lambda expression back sort of infinitely until well, until you limit it somehow. So generate will just generate stuff forever until you tell it to stop. I guess the main difference between the RxJava version is that the generator can actually decide when to shut things down. You don't have to limit it or take it to limit the amount of values. In contrast, the streams generate will just keep going forever, and you have to limit it through some other means, like using the limit method. OK, so that's the end of yet another factory method operator that comes with the observable class. And it also demonstrates the difference between hot and cold observables.